this bill to the House.
Question is that the motion be agreed to. Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is yet another paper tiger from National and their ongoing mission to project the image to the New Zealand public that they're actually doing something about the housing crisis. And we've come to expect this from Nick Smith, and now we see the local government minister taking a similar path. This bill deals with much more than housing affordability, but I want to focus my comments, sir, on the development contribution components of the bill. Our view is that this bill represents a wasted opportunity. This would have been a great opportunity for a thorough and fundamental review of the way that we fund infrastructure and services to support new urban development and new residential developments. Sadly, because of the shallow and limited approach that this government has taken on this issue, as they have with so many other aspects of housing policy, this bill will make, we believe, very little difference, if any. It will make perhaps a small contribution to reducing the cost of building a new home. And it's another example of National chasing a headline and trying to convey the idea and throw people off the scent, really, and distract them from the reality, which is that very little of substance has been done by this government on housing affordability. So in a nutshell, the changes to the development contributions regime are better than nothing, but that's a very, very low bar. What the bill does, essentially, is that it gives developers the right to appeal against development contributions that are levied on them by councils. It sets up a review process. And arguably that will give some transparency to the process and may impose a little bit of discipline on councils who, it's argued by some, are using development contributions as revenue gathering. So the second thing that it does is that it limits the things that councils can levy development contributions for, and it excludes community infrastructure. So from now on, councils will not be able to levy development contributions for local parks and reserves, for swimming pools and community facilities and local libraries. And that's a distinction that National chooses to make, that community infrastructure is not necessary, that it's a nice to have, and what it will mean inevitably is that some councils will find themselves in the position of approving developments and subdivisions, and those new communities won't get the community infrastructure that they should be able to expect, sir. And it shows the values. It shows the values that National has, that they don't regard community facilities like swimming pools, like local libraries and community halls are as important as water and electricity, sir. Now that's National's value system. That's the choice they choose to make. But what it means, and it actually harks back to Bill English's comments the other day, where he said developers should be able to build more shoebox apartments. That's his idea, that people should be able to live in shoebox apartments and not have access to community facilities. That's National's solution to the housing crisis. Well, the big consequence of this bill actually is that the costs of infrastructure and services for development are going to get pushed over to the ratepayer. And the Auckland Council submitted that what this bill will mean for them is an 8.5% increase on the average rates bill by 2021-22. So an average increase of 8.5% on the rates over the next 7 years. That's what Auckland Council said. They provided the workings, they provided the calculations. The impact of this bill is going to mean that the ratepayer is going to have to pick up the cost. It's being shunted from the buyers of new homes onto the general ratepayer. And I just think that's an irony, because for the last 5 years, this National government has railed against councils and all their irresponsible borrowing and irresponsible spending. But actually what this bill does is that it simply shifts the cost that developers normally pass on to the buyers of new homes. Those costs are going to be passed on to the general ratepayer. Now, that's an irony. Arguably, that is a reasonable policy choice to consider. In the middle of a housing crisis, it is perfectly valid to consider where you draw the line between the user pays approach that is embodied in development contributions and the rest of the community paying for the infrastructure and services that support new development. That's a reasonable policy choice to consider. But I don't want the National Party members in the House today to leave here thinking that they can simply shovel the costs from the buyers of new homes to the general ratepayer. Someone has to pay, all right? That's the reality. Someone has to pay for this infrastructure, and what the National Party is doing is simply getting the ratepayer to pick up the tab. Yes. What this is, sir, is the National Party just kicking the can down the road. They pretend to be serious about tackling the drivers of expensive housing, but in fact they're doing nothing. They are just kicking the can down the road. If they were serious about tackling the cost of infrastructure and services, they would have done a much more fundamental review of how the costs of new development are shared out and how they are dealt with. And I want to just put on the record, sir, for the benefit of this debate, 3 areas that National could have addressed if they were serious about this problem. The first is that they could have considered the idea of spreading the cost of infrastructure and services for new development over the lifetime of that infrastructure. So what happens with almost all the other costs are that they get loaded onto the price tag of a new house, and that they get capitalised into the value of that house and structured into the market price of new housing in this country. That's what happens. And while it may be only 4% on average, development contributions contribute 4% according to the government's own figures of the cost of a new build. When you add all the other costs of infrastructure and services that a developer has to pick up, it can add $50,000, $60,000, even $70,000 to the cost of a new house. Now, that gets added straight onto the price tag of a new house, and that is a huge barrier for the New Zealand home buyer, and particularly the first home buyer. Now, one approach that the New Zealand Initiative has done a lot of work on is spreading that cost over the lifetime of the asset, sir. And one way to do this in the New Zealand context would be to pay for that infrastructure and those services by bonds, by taking advantage, sir, of the low cost of borrowing for local government, and then using a targeted rate to pay that back over the next 30 to 50 years. That wouldn't reduce the cost, but it would at least spread it. The government could have considered what a number of overseas jurisdictions do, and that's use development levies or contributions to incentivise the kind of development that you want. For example, more intensification, more brownfields development instead of sprawl. But no, they showed no interest in that. They could have chosen a productivity approach by getting together with industry and the private sector to look at how infrastructure and services for new urban development could be done in a more efficient way and make cost savings that would ultimately be passed on to the home buyer. A lot of new urban developments are employing more sophisticated process management of the process of laying down broadband and the 3 waters and electricity and roads and footpaths and lighting and all the infrastructure that goes into new subdivisions, and they are doing that and they are saving a lot of money. And if the government worked with the private sector to template that kind of approach, then they could have delivered real cost savings. Instead of this paper tiger, Mr. Speaker, all we're seeing is Nick Smith and his cronies in the National Cabinet pretending to do something about housing affordability, just like they pretended that taking the tariffs off varnish and nails and gibboard in the budget last week would save $3,500 for the first home buyer, with no thinking about how they'd prevent that windfall being pocketed by builders and developers in an overheated market. And just like their lame Auckland Housing Accord, which will struggle to do any more than what the market is already delivering in terms of new development, sir. This is a disappointment, sir, and like we did at the first reading, Labor will vote for this with serious reservations.
Honourable Nikki Webb.